the Marquesa de Montemayor. Any Spanish schoolboy is required to know today more about Donna Maria Escria de Montemayor than Brother Juniper was to discover in years of research. Within a century of her death, her letters had become one of the monuments of Spanish literature, and her life and times have ever since been an object of long studies. But her biographers have erred in one direction as greatly as the Franciscan did in another. They have tried to invest her with a host of graces, to read back into her life, and person come of such beauty that abound in her letters, whereas all real knowledge of this wonderful woman must proceed from the act of her humiliating her, and in divesting all of her beauties save one. She was the daughter of a cloth merchant who had acquired the money and the hatred of the Limans within a stone's throw of the plaza. Her childhood was unhappy. She was ugly, she stuttered, her mother persecuted with her sarcasms in an effort to arouse some social charms, and forced her to go about the town in a veritable harness of jewels. She lived alone and thought alone. Many suitors presented themselves, but as long as she fought against the convention of her time and was determined to remain single. There was hysterical scenes with her mother, recriminations, screams, slamming of doors. At least at 26, she found herself penned into marriage with a supercilious and ruined nobleman, and the cathedral of Lima fairly buzzed with the sneers of her guests. Still she lived alone, and thought alone, and when an exquisite daughter was born to her, she fastened upon her idolatrous love. But little Clara took after her father. She was cold and intellectual. At the age of 8, she was calmly corrected, and her mother's speech presentingly regarded her with astonishment and repulsion. The frightening mother became meek and obsequious, but she could not present herself from persecuting Donna Clara, with nervous attention and fatiguing love. Again, there were hysterical recriminations, screams, slamming of doors. From the offers of marriages that fell onto her, Donna Clara deliberately chose the one that required her removal to Spain. So to Spain she went, to that land from which it takes 6 months to receive an answer to one's letter. The leave-taking before was so long a voyage it became in Peru, one of the formal services of the church. The ship was blessed, and as the peace widened between the vessel and the beach, brought both companies knelt and sang a hymn that never failed to sound weak and timid in all that open air. Donna Clara sailed with the most admirable composure, leaving her mother to gaze after the bright ship, her hand pressing now her heart, now her mouth. Blurred and streaked became her view of the serene Pacific, and enormous clouds of peril hung over her, forever motionless above it. Left alone in Lima, the Marquesa's life grew more and more inward. She became increasingly negligent in her dress, and like all lonely people, she talked to herself audibly. All of her existence lay in the burning center of her mind. On that stage were performed endless dialogues with her daughter, impossible reconciliations, scenes internally recommenced of remorse and forgiveness. On the street you behold an old woman, her red wig fallen a little over one ear, her left cheek angry with leprous affection, her right with complimentary adjustment of rogue. Her chin was never dry, her lips never still. Lima was a city of entresses, but even there she became its jest, as she drove through the streets or shuffled up on the steps of churches. She was thought to be continuously drunk. Worse things were said of her, and petitions were afloat that she be locked up. She had been denounced 3 times before the Inquisition. It is not impossible that she might have been burned, and her son-in-law less influential in Spain, and she had not somehow collected a few friends about her in the vigiral court, who suffered for her and her oddity and her wide reading. The distressing character of the relations between mother and daughter were further embittered and by misunderstandings and money. When the Condesa received a handsome allowance from her mother and frequent gifts, Donna Clara soon became an outstanding woman of intelligence at the Spanish court. All the wealth of Peru would have been insufficient to maintain her grandiose style, she fancied for herself. Strangely enough, her extravagance proceeded from one of the best traits in her nature. She regarded her friends, her servants, and all interesting people in the capital as her children. In fact, there seemed only one person in the world towards she did not expend herself in all kinds of offices. Among her protégés was the choreographer de Basilis, whose map of the New World was dedicated to Marquesa de Montemayor, amid the roars of the courtiers at Lima, who read that she was the admiration of her city and a rising sun in the west. Another was a scientist, Azarosa, whose treatise on the laws of hydraulics was suppressed by the Inquisition as being too exciting. For a decade, the Condesa literally sustained all the arts and sciences of Spain. It was not her fault that nothing memorable was produced in that time. About 4 years after Donna Clara's departure, Donna Maria received her permission to visit Europe. On both sides of the visit, there was anticipated with resolutions well nourished on self-approach, the one to be patient, the other to be undemonstrative. Both failed. Each tortured the other and was on the point of losing her mind under the alternations of self-rebuke and outbursts of passion. At length, one day Donna Maria rose before dawn, daring no more than to kiss the door behind which her daughter was sleeping, took ship, and returned to America. Henceforth, letter-writing had to take the place of all affection and that could be not lived. Hers were the letters that in an astonishing world have become the textbook of schoolboys and anthills of grim Martians. Donna Maria would have invented her genius had she not been born with it. So necessary was it to prove her love that to attract the attention, perhaps the admiration of her distant child. She forced herself to go out into society in order to cull its ridicules. She taught her eye to observe and she read the masterpieces of her language to discover its effects. She insinuated herself into the company of those who were celebrated for convention. Night after night, in her Baroque palace, she wrote and rewrote the incredible pages, forcing from her despairing mind those miracles of wit and grace, whose distilled chronicles